Welcome to the Communicating Capital podcast, where finance and communication get a fresh perspective. Hosted by a dynamic team of women in the industry, we're here to redefine the conversation with candid, no-nonsense interviews featuring top executives, communication experts, and industry leaders. With a focus on real-world clarity and real-world impact, we make the complex world of finance digestible and relatable. So whether you're a seasoned professional or you're just interested in our world, welcome to Communicating Capital. Today joining us from San Diego, California is Yujia. Yujia is the founder and CEO of Orange Group, a firm dedicated exclusively to supporting companies within the Bitcoin industry. With a deep expertise in Bitcoin, Yujia and his team help bridge the gap between Bitcoin's complex world and the strategic financial services needed for its success. I've truly learned so much from him in such a short time. So Yujia, it's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thanks for having me on, Jessica. I'm excited for the discussion.
So excited, especially now with Bitcoin, which we're going to talk about in a moment, because I feel like all eyes are on Bitcoin, all eyes are on Bitcoin miners as of late. But before we start talking about the industry specifics, I'd love to hear your background and your journey into Bitcoin and your journey into IR. Tell us a little bit about Yujia.
You want the long version or the short version?
The long version. We want the long version.
Yeah, I have over 20 years. Experience working with public companies. I started my career with Deloitte, one of the big four public accounting firms. Got my CPA and was doing energy and manufacturing audits. So spent a couple of years there, but where I was living, I was in West Hartford, Connecticut at the time. There was a great opportunity of a small cap solar company that was going public, and they were looking for an internal investor relations person. So I decided to hop on because they were going through an exciting IPO, and that's something I really wanted to learn. That was my role into first step into the world of investor relations. There, I spent about 3.5 years there, and we went through the IPO and then helped build up the investor relations function from bottoms up. And eventually I ended up managing investor relations at the company. When I was there, I was working with an external investor relations consultant from one of the largest firms in the world, ICR. You probably are very familiar with them. And so he kind of taught me all the ropes around investor relations, and I was following his guidance. So spent a few years there. But then when I was in investor relations, working with Wall Street, the sell side analysts, the institutional investors, I was always very impressed with their expertise on the industry, on the business, the questions that they were asking. I was always just impressed by their just knowledge of the capital markets and how to dissect the company's business and its strategies, right? And what was important to investors. Fast forward a few years, I was trying to figure out how to get a job on Wall Street and landed a role doing equity research at a small boutique firm here out in San Diego. I was in Connecticut at the time, and specifically doing short selling equity research.
Oh, interesting.
So essentially looking for taking a company using an accounting lens, kind of like forensic and technical accounting, dissecting their financial statements, their SEC filings, all of their investment materials, looking for reasons why a company's earnings may not be sustainable and why a company may be a good short candidate instead of, buy and hold. And that was a very great learning experience and my real first step into capital markets. Now, my Bitcoin story kind of has, the genesis of my Bitcoin story kind of has to do a little bit with what happened at Voyant, because that's when the first time I heard about Bitcoin. I think it was around $200, and I quickly shot to $200 to $800. This was the 2014 cycle.
Wow.
And of course, obviously, we were doing short selling equity research. So I was taught to be pretty much look at everything with a very skeptical lens. And so, I didn't think much of it, but that was the first time I had heard of it. The other thing that really I think catalyzed me to eventually understand Bitcoin. So when I was doing short selling equity research, we really caught the big trend of e-commerce disrupting traditional retailers. And even though it was a raging bull market for those 10 years because of, very low interest rates, almost zero interest rates after the 2008 financial crisis and all the money printing from the quantitative easings, we were still able to be pretty successful in our research. And, the stuff that we were putting together and the individual companies that I had found and I was covering, man, I think I had close to 75% win rate on my research. And
oh, wow.
One of the biggest, my proudest ones, this company called Rent a Center, I took them down for 75%. And I was able to call, exactly in sequence all the different missteps that had happened, from a earnings miss to them having to change their full year guidance. I found a 0% margin revenue scheme that they were running to kind of make their numbers look a lot better than they actually were.
Oh, that's horrible.
But then,
that they were doing that.
An inventory write down, a goodwill impairment, and then they were forced, and then they had to miss all their, debt covenants, and then they were forced to essentially stop paying dividends to shareholders. It was just like everything. And I was putting it on Seeking Alpha at the time too. And I quickly went from like having 0 followers to 10,000 followers from my research. But because I had come from an accounting background and really didn't grow up around markets and just learning how to invest, I didn't make any real money out of it. I think I put in $200 into a put option and didn't hold it for long, and only made I made $200 in and $2,000 out. But I was like, why did I only put in $200? This is one of my highest conviction ideas. I spent, 10s, 20s of hours researching this thing. And so that was like I was so upset at myself. That's what catalyzed me to really go and figure out and to just read everything I could read and learn about markets and how to be a better investor. And so I went on like a 5-year journey of reading every single book that I could find. I think I was doing like 50 books a year. And that eventually led to me reading Bitcoin Standard and going down that rabbit hole. So that kind of that was probably one of the biggest drivers of my Bitcoin story. But the first time I really started, I think, interacting with Bitcoin was in 2017. I was leading corporate finance and FP&A at Qualcomm at that point.
Oh, nice.
I had a team of 6 under me. We were essentially the right hand of the CFO across all the major strategic deals. But behind the scenes, I was really just trying to figure out markets and trading my own money, reading everything I could find, listening to podcasts. And 2017, I went to a growth and tech investor conference, and there was a girl on stage. Her name was Meltem Demirors, and I don't know where she works now, but she was at CoinShares, one of the largest VCs in this crypto space. Oh, wow. And this was 2017. Bitcoin was around $5,000, and she was on stage and she gave a presentation on Bitcoin, and she said, "I'm a Bitcoin maximalist," which means I hold 100% of my net worth in Bitcoin.
Oh, wow.
So and she said she had gotten in around $200, and, she was well on her way to retiring. And by 10,000, she, may think about diversifying into other things. So that was, so I was very impressed, sitting there. And then obviously when I was thinking back about Bitcoin when it was at 200 and went to 800, and I kind of, didn't think much of it and thought it was kind of a scam. But now we're sitting at 5,000. Like, wait a minute, what's going on here, right? So then I started trading Bitcoin that cycle in 2017 and traded it all the way up to 20 and wrote it all the way down. And so it wasn't until like the 2019, 2020 timeframe that in the bear market, after I continued to watch it, went from when I first got in, I started trading it, went up to 20,000. And in the bear market, I think went all the way down to like 3,000. But then, because I'm watching this thing and I'm watching markets, when I first saw it go back it went to like 7,000 and then hit 14,000 sometime in 2019. That was like, wait a minute, something's going on here. So I really started digging in and going down the rabbit hole on Bitcoin. Fast forward a little bit more, 2020, there's a bit of a backstory where I did an expat assignment when I was at Qualcomm in 2018 through 2019. And so I spent about a year there. And in September 2019, right before COVID hit, I was coming back from that assignment. And so, but because I spent a year there, I was on WeChat, I was on all these social media apps, and just, I had friends in China at that point. And so I was always kind of on these social media apps. And I think it was like February 2020 when, there were rumors of this virus coming out of Wuhan, China. So I was paying attention. I was on Twitter. I was on Chinese social media apps, and I was seeing all these crazy videos. You hear about COVID getting onto these cruise ships and the R naught of, I can't remember, I think it was like a 2, and it was doubling every 7 days. And, a couple of people had it on the cruise ships, and then it was like the entire deck and then the entire cruise ship. And I was watching videos on YouTube of all these expats in China coming back to the US from China, going through customs, just saying like, wow, they didn't check anyone through the, screening and customs. There weren't any, and people were sick on the plane, coughing, fevers. And then you hear about getting into the US, and I was, holy crap, this thing is about to hit New York. So I got out of everything. I sold, like, liquidated my entire retirement, all my brokerage accounts outside of retirement. And just right before the stock market crashed, you know, when it hit New York from COVID, I think it was sometime mid-March.
Yep.
And so I was watching this thing go down. So, you know, Bitcoin, I think around that time was 8,000. And within a couple hours, it had fallen to $4,000, right? So it was very, you know, Bitcoin's just very volatile. But that was the biggest drop in history at that point in time. The biggest by magnitude, and the pace of the drop, 50% in a matter of hours. But at the same time, you know, the traditional financial markets, like the stock market, was also going down quite fast. And I think it was like, it was going down for like 3 or 4 days, right? And, but what I noticed when watching all of that go down was, with the traditional financial markets, they were, you know, having to hit circuit breaker after circuit breaker and stop and halt trading, right? Mm-hmm. And then by the end of it, you know, and at that point I had done enough reading to understand that the existing monetary system, it's a debt-based monetary system. It's really just kind of a house of cards, right? And they really can't let the financial markets collapse, kind of just like 2008, and they had to step in and bail it out. I was pretty certain that, it's too big to fail. We can't let the markets crash, and then the economy crashes, and it's deflationary, and then you can never pay back the debt that the entire monetary system is based on. So, and then they're talking about $10 trillion of liquidity injection to bail it out. So, yeah. Well, at the same time, I'm watching Bitcoin, right? It's dropped 50%, and I'm afraid of what the domino effects of that, you know, what that implies if the whole market goes down. So I was scrambling and sending Bitcoin from my Coinbase to my cold storage. And when I was doing that, I was like, hey, wait a minute, like Bitcoin, this network, it's still running like seamlessly, flawlessly. It's tick-tock, next block every 10 minutes. There's nothing that's kind of stopping this transaction. No one's halting it. Yes, it's fallen by 50% in terms of the price. But then that's when I realized, like, wait a minute, Bitcoin, yes, the price is volatile, but it's actually the most stable financial system or network in the world. And by that time, I had kind of recognized or realized or understood the absolute fixed supply of Bitcoin. So it's like the most scarce thing in the world. I realized, like, okay, so this is like the only economic constant that we have, or the most stable financial system or network in the world. And so it's really actually, from that sense, because it's into perpetuity. So I kind of recognized that this is the most durable and permanent financial network in existence into perpetuity. So that was like my orange, like really, the light bulb turned on for me at that moment. And I separated price volatility from risk. So Bitcoin is, to me, at this point, the world's only risk-free asset without counterparty risk, because it's a digital bearer asset. If you hold it yourself, there is no liabilities behind it. It's 1 out of 21 million. It can never be debased. And it's the most permanent thing we have in this world outside of, you know, one of the most certain things that we have, because at the end of the day, it's just math. It's just like big numbers but it's as certain as 1 + 1 = 2. So it's mathematical certainty, and all the different components of it puts it together. So that was my like big orange pilling moment. And so I essentially just went all in on Bitcoin at that point and never traded again.
That's amazing.
And that was my moment. So that was 2020. And since then, I've just kind of, you know, been this Bitcoin maximalist. By the end of 2021, I was at Qualcomm. And so the reason why, and I can talk about the Orange Group thing now, because, you know, as I looked at my career at Qualcomm, I was there for about 8 years. I was climbing up the ladder, but the higher you go, the more political it gets, right? And even though I was making more money, because I didn't love the semiconductors, I wasn't expert at it, and because I was coming at it from a just high level through corporate finance. Right. I realized, like, look, if I spend the rest of my career here, I'm still not going to be able to compete with just like the engineers, the biz dev guys that just grew up with this industry. Like, they probably grew up in this industry in the 90s and 2000s, and they just kind of saw everything that happened with their own eyes in terms of the industry, all the competitors or companies out there, and what works, what doesn't. They just understand it at such a deeper level than I do from just like a corporate finance view. That's kind of the realization that I had. And then it was, well, I understand Bitcoin, and I know a lot of people don't understand Bitcoin. kind of 99% of the world doesn't understand Bitcoin. And then I was watching all these Bitcoin miners go public because it's a very capital intensive industry, and they want to access the public markets to raise capital to fund their growth, right? So I kind of saw a big gap in the market, and I realized that, and by the way, I just really wanted to work in the Bitcoin industry. At that point, I was, all in and watching this thing every single day and following it every single day. And so I just thought it'd be smart to go work in the Bitcoin industry or pursue, a career in the Bitcoin industry because I have an edge against probably 99% of the world that doesn't understand this thing. And because I understand it, I thought I'd be able to do a good job and be able to help Bitcoin companies tell their stories better than someone that doesn't understand it, right? So 2021 is when I left Qualcomm, and I joined Blue Shirt Group, which is one of the world's largest global IR advisory firms. The funny coincidence is that the person that brought me into Blue Shirt was the same consultant that I had back when I was in internal IR for the solar company.
Way.
So we had always stayed in touch. Yeah. So we stayed in touch, and we actually connected in China when I spent that year in China. It's actually where it's actually even a smaller world, because he went and joined Blue Shirt, left ICR, joined Blue Shirt, and started his own Asia Pacific and China practice. So he was in China. That's how I reconnected with him, and then we had stayed in touch. Right. And I was telling him that I really kind of want to get more involved on the IR side for Bitcoin companies. He said, well, come to Blue Shirt, and you can help build your own franchise here. And so that's what I did. And so I spent about 2 years at Blue Shirt and built it up. So I had semis under me, and then also Bitcoin. And I built up Bitcoin side of the business to work with more Bitcoin companies than all the other competing firms combined in that 2 years at Blue Shirt. And then by the end of that, Blue Shirt didn't really support me on what I was trying to do in Bitcoin. Like, they weren't very receptive to what I was writing or my thoughts about Bitcoin on social media. And they're very just skeptical and were just less hesitant to kind of, they told me not to write anything and put it on social media about Bitcoin because they just didn't believe in it in themselves. So I didn't have much internal support. So I left Blue Shirt to go start Orange Group. So I started Orange Group at the beginning of this year in 2024, and it's almost at a year. And
so amazing.
And Orange Group is a Bitcoin-only, Bitcoin-focused investor relations advisory firm.
So amazing.
And we work with, I think, in my mind, the best public Bitcoin companies in the industry.
I agree with you that you do as well. And for those that are listening and just listen to Yujia's incredible story of how he got into Bitcoin and into IR, what stood out to me the most is that you did so much of your own research that you trust what you're doing. And you're following your lead. You're saying that you're full on into Bitcoin, like full Bitcoin, as well as like Bitcoin maximalist, which is so interesting to me because I didn't know that necessarily. I thought that there might be some other sides, but it makes sense now. You're so knowledgeable about Bitcoin. You're so knowledgeable about the clients that you have, the Bitcoin miners that I know that you work with on the day-to-day. And I also know you just came out of earnings season with these companies, and I know they all did phenomenally from what I saw. So it's incredible to hear that. One thing I do want to ask you is because I know that you were working in different sectors prior to pivoting to Bitcoin, and now that you're working in IR, what type of communication strategies differ for Bitcoin companies? Is it like a regulatory component? Is it because there's like price volatility in Bitcoin versus your other clients that you might have had in the past while you were working at Blue Shirt Group?
Yeah, well, the biggest difference is that 99% of the world still doesn't understand Bitcoin, and because they don't understand it, they don't believe in it, right? So in terms of the messaging for our clients, you definitely have to adapt it to whatever audience you can get that's paying attention, right? And so in this industry, it's very different than traditional industries that are more mature, and there's established like conferences and mature investors that understand the industry. For Bitcoin, and I'm not talking about like the HPC-AI development, for Bitcoin companies or the Bitcoin mining or the Bitcoin side of these companies, the majority of the investors still to this day are retail investors that have a decent understanding or, very strong understanding of Bitcoin, that's looking to get exposure to Bitcoin through these public companies because they view the public companies as having or giving them a leveraged exposure to Bitcoin, so that the returns on these companies like the Bitcoin miners is going to be higher than what they can get on Bitcoin.
Got it.
So that's just human nature and greed, right? Even though Bitcoin has been compounding at 60% a year, and you can, do very well just sitting in Bitcoin. Human nature, and humans will always try to do more and get as much as they can. And so at the end of the day, the bulk of the investors in public company equities for Bitcoin businesses that are public are still retail. And so you really have to kind of cater your messaging and your story to them. At the same time, you can't just give up on the institutional investors because they control the bulk of the capital, right? So if one fund gets interested because you do a good job telling that story, or maybe if we orange pill him and get them to understand the potential of Bitcoin and they make an investment, it's 5, 10, 20, $100 million.
Right. Substantial.
So it's substantial. So you can't really just give up on the institutional side. So you just have to really cater your messaging and tell it a different way. For Bitcoin miners, for example, with Iris Energy. So that was a challenge that we had when I started working with them 3 years ago. In the beginning, we'd go to these traditional Wall Street investor conferences, and our schedules would just be be like 3 or 4 meetings for the whole day, if that, from the institutional investors, because people just didn't believe in the space. And Bitcoin is, I think, around $20,000 at a time just 2 years ago. So you have to tell the story a bit differently. Instead of saying, hey, we are a Bitcoin miner, we are a data center company, right? Or we are an energy infrastructure company, because energy is also a scarce asset that is going to be highly in demand because of all the, of our continued adoption of digital technologies, right? AI that needs a lot of power from the data centers, that's competing for access to the energy grid. So those are just some small examples, but in terms of the messaging. But yeah, the Bitcoin industry is the Wild West. It's very early days. And so as an IR guy in this industry, it's you can't just sit back and do, what's traditionally done in an IR role, which is just the quarterly earnings and the conference circuits in between. Because I'm a Bitcoiner and my incentives are aligned with my clients, really, the way I approach it is just, in me and Cody, who's on my team at Orange Group here in the US, it's all hands on deck. We just do whatever we can to help, whether it's investor relations or business development, making the right connections within the industry and the ecosystem, or just very manual labor type of work, which is CRM, and helping them input, tracking investors that are interested in this space and making sure it's taken down in a CRM database so that they can go back to them, right? And stay connected, continue to build that relationship, because we're so early.
Given that Bitcoin is so transformative and everybody's eyes are on it, right? I don't know if about everybody, but I have to say, if it's going to hit 100 grand soon, maybe it already did, if somebody's tuning into this episode at a later date, I feel like it's getting more and more mainstream. People are starting to believe in it. They want to look into it a little bit more. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin's long-term impact on finance, and what role do you think it'll play in the global economy in the years to come?
Wow.
Yeah, big question.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, Bitcoin is the best money ever discovered.
Awesome.
And to me, it's not like this technology or people sometimes call it a commodity, or this asset that you buy. To me, it's just money. It's simple as that. It's the best form of money ever discovered, and because of its properties. And the most critical one is that perfect scarcity. There's nothing else as scarce as Bitcoin's supply, other than a human's time on Earth. So those two are the only two things that are perfectly scarce, right? Like even gold, which has been a store of value for civilization for the longest time.
Yep.
Even gold inflates at, I think, above ground gold is about 16 trillion today, and gold still inflates about 1.5% to 2% a year. Because gold production companies are still mining for gold, and they're still finding gold reserves in the ground, and who knows how much gold there is outside of Earth, right? So to me, gold is not perfectly scarce, and then when the price of gold goes up, miners are incentivized to look for more of it because they can sell it for a higher price. So then the inflation rate on gold actually can increase like 2%, 3%, right? So there's nothing that really can constrain the total supply of gold into the future. Whereas Bitcoin is the only thing that's like perfectly fixed and absolutely scarce at 21 million. And you really have to kind of do the work to understand why that is. I think it would take a while to explain that. But taking a step back, because of all those properties, and especially because of the perfect scarcity of Bitcoin, to me, it's the best money that's ever been discovered. And really what's happening now and going forward is that Bitcoin is just capitalizing into the world's next money that people will be eventually using as a medium of exchange for buying and selling and saving. Right. But we're still very early. Even though Bitcoin is at $100,000, it's still a drop in the bucket relative to the total TAM of money and stores of values. Bitcoin at 100K, it's still slightly below $2 trillion in market value, which is nothing. If you think about the total global asset base, Bitcoin's at 2 trillion. Above ground gold, right above that, it's 16 trillion. Global equities, it's about, this is like the US stock market, London, Hong Kong, et cetera, about $100 trillion. Global real estate is right. It's around $200 trillion. Global fiat base, like dollars, euros, yen, RMB, all the fiat government currencies, about 100 trillion. So that's the gold's definitely the first thing that it takes out, but then it's taking out like a good chunk of the global fiat base.
Right.
But the biggest market above all of that is the global debt market. So there's sovereign debt, corporate debt, private debt, et cetera. But like the sovereign debt market is the biggest market of all. And that's like north of 500, 700 trillion. No one actually even knows how big it is because there's a lot of shadow banking and behind the scenes. So that's like the TAM of, value in the world. And, I strongly believe Bitcoin takes out a good chunk of each of those over time. And so it's going to, so I don't look at Bitcoin based on the dollar price per Bitcoin because it's misleading. I look at it based on the market cap relative to the total TAM, the total addressable market, which is north of, to me, even if you haircut all those numbers, it's north of $500 trillion, and Bitcoin is still only sitting at 5. What people don't understand is that because Bitcoin is money is the thing that underlies everything else, right? It's the unit of account that denominates all value, goods and services. So if Bitcoin is able to be successful at continuing to monetize and capitalize into that new form of money, replacing fiat, then it's, 50 trillion, 100 trillion, 200 trillion. Eventually, that's where Bitcoin's going. Eventually, we're not going to be talking about Bitcoin based on like Bitcoin per dollar, like $100,000 per Bitcoin, where, goods and services will be priced against Bitcoin. So the coffee that we buy at Starbucks will probably cost like, I'm making numbers up, but like 25 to 50 sats, which is, small fractions of Bitcoin. That's kind of what I think will happen because of the economic incentives, because of what's happening with the existing fiat debt-based monetary system and with technology. That's just this kind of, to me, the only kind of direction that I can go.
So fascinating, Yujia. I'm like beyond fascinated hearing everything that you're saying. You are so educated in the space and you have so much knowledge. I would love to talk to you again in like 2 months from now after we see, I don't know if it will surpass 100K or if more mainstream adopters come in, or if there's more companies that come in that want to have Bitcoin on their balance sheet that I'm seeing a lot now and with different companies too. It's just fascinating and there's so much to learn and you are just so knowledgeable and I absolutely appreciate that. Before we wrap up, do you have one piece of final advice for any of our listeners who are interested in perhaps following your footsteps in the Bitcoin space?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the most important things happening in our world today. It's definitely a paradigm shift. And look, I've been encouraging all my friends and family to study this thing for the past 4 years. Most people don't listen to me. So I'll say it here, but I don't expect too many people to listen, but it's important. You should definitely study it and try to understand what's happening, because if you do, you'll benefit significantly from that. Right. And, the direction that where everything is going now is that I think inflation will continue if you're on a dollar system, right? Because they have to continue to print more debt into the system because it's not sustainable by itself. And so the currency will continue to get debased. So if you're saving in dollars, you'll continue to see inflation. Whereas if you're saving in Bitcoin, you get deflation, you get the opposite. So, things are getting cheaper for people that save in Bitcoin, right? So that's the most important thing.
I love it. This has been one of the most fascinating conversations I've had in quite a long time. Yujia, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. So everyone listening in, thank you for joining Communicating Capital today. For our listeners who want to connect with Yujia, this information are in our show notes. But of course, feel free to reach out to him on LinkedIn. I'm sure he'd love to speak with you if you're interested in learning more about his space. As always, thanks for joining us. Talk to you soon.